Hello, Rank Squad, and welcome to the Ranks FC YouTube channel, where today we're going to be looking at some of the interesting Premier League trends that have permeated this season. It's been a bit of a madness in the Premier League at times. There have been teams that have fallen from grace. There have been results that have shocked everybody. There have been heroes and villains that have perhaps been more of the unlikely statures. We're going to be looking at some different elements across the league today. My name is Jack Collins, and I'll be your host. I'm joined by the rank god, Mr. Sam Ty. How you doing, mate?
I'm very well, thank you, mate. Fresh off a nice dig into the toolbox to find us some interesting trends and some interesting statistics. We were a little bit stuck for a topic this week, to an extent. Usually, we've typically been covering players who are, basically making huge transfers. We thought we'd take a little break from that, look for something a little bit different. So I just started digging through all the statistics, see what I could find, and I've picked up about 6 or 7 things that I think are quite illuminating, quite interesting, and we'll share them with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question straight away from Ahmad, who says, is there a Q&A at the end? If we have time at the end, we'll see if we can answer some of your questions as well. But let's get straight into it, shall we, Sam? Let's take a look at a first thing, and it's passes per defensive action. The team's at the top of this. I think maybe it'd be easiest to kind of explain what it is and then what it stands for, really.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful of a statistical term, isn't it? Passes per defensive action, and like ideally you would probably, immediately messed it up. Passes per defensive action, and really there should be another word on the end there. It should be passes per defensive, passes allowed per defensive action, because this measures ultimately how many passes you are allowing your opponents to string together in a sequence before you step in and disrupt somehow defensively. So, obviously take the ball off them, intercept, tackle, force it out of play, whatever it is. The lower this number tends to be, the trend is the more active defensively the team are. So it probably means they're pressing higher. And I think that's reflected here. I think if you were to think of the teams in the Premier League that are a bit more active, a bit more front-footed, press a bit heavier than the others, I think you would definitely think of Man City and Arsenal. You'd certainly think of Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool. You probably assume Chelsea are around and about there. But what I found really interesting was that Newcastle, smack bang in the middle of this. And by pretty much every metric we've got, Newcastle are a top team. And then when you watch them this season, they're clearly a top side. And they really belong in this little top 5 here. And one of the big things that has gone for them this season has been their press is really good. Like really, really good. Defensively speaking, everyone's going on about the clean sheets. But it's not about, sitting in and absorbing pressure and Nick Pope being super busy. Yes, he has to make a couple of good saves. But team-wise, Eddie Howe has got this team. Like they are so well structured when they press. And I wasn't surprised to see them in this list. But it did kind of lighten my heart a little bit when I did see them, because I think it's recognition.
Yeah, I mean, obviously people are going to look at this and be like, okay, the 3 teams in the middle are right at the top of the pile. Liverpool and Chelsea are 2 sides who most will agree have fallen off from what we expected of them this year. So to see Chelsea top of this is relatively interesting. Now, obviously, it's not a metric that determines how good you are as a side. It's a metric that determines mostly, how well that press works. But I don't think that many people would have looked at this and gone, Chelsea have the most effective press in the Premier League this season. And so it's interesting to see them in the mix.
Yes, I mean, I'm definitely surprised to see them top. I mean, I guess I maybe didn't even expect them to see them in the top 5. To be clear, like this isn't a case of like how good is your press,
no,
and you're not saying that, but it's a general pointer as to how disruptive you are off the ball. Now, if you think about, last couple of years, I've been tracking this statistic for years now, and Ralph Hasenhüttl's Southampton were usually in the top 5. Pep Guardiola's teams always top 5. Klopp's teams always top 5. If Bielsa's in the league, Leeds are in there as well. That's the kind of style we're talking about here. And yes, I think you probably look at that from Arsenal and from City, from Arteta and Guardiola. Klopp still around. Eddie Howe jumped into the conversation. Just, I wouldn't necessarily expect it from Chelsea. But I think this probably suggests that intensity off the ball definitely isn't their greatest problem. And yes, they've got some other issues, but I don't think this is the area that Graham Potter really, really needs to work on anytime soon.
Yeah, I like this from Finton, who said Chelsea's drop-off has been offensively, not defensively, to be fair, which is probably about spot on. Let's come to the other end of this table. And look, again, these aren't, it's important to be like, these aren't the things that determine where you end up in a Premier League table, but it definitely helps.
Yeah. So the funny thing about this statistic is the higher the number is, the worse you are, which is a bit counterintuitive. Obviously, West Ham here at rock bottom, allowing on average 14.25 passes per defensive action. So opponents are stringing together sequences of about 14 and a bit passes before West Ham do anything about it. The worst I've ever seen in this statistic is Steve Bruce's Newcastle United. So only a year ago, and they were down at around 17. So for Newcastle to chop that in half really does illustrate how different things are now under Eddie Howe. What I'm trying to say by that as well is that these figures aren't disastrous, but what they do point to are passive teams. These teams are not getting in your face. They are not disrupting you. They are allowing teams to put together very long spells of possession, long spells of pressure. And if you do, I mean, isn't this basically just like the bottom five, except for Southampton?
Yeah, it's not. It's not, as we say, a perfect metric, but it's definitely something that affects where you end up, I think.
100%, yeah. So illuminative for sure. And we can use this as a bit of a guide. And teams that are struggling in the league do tend to be down here because they're just not stamping their authority on games. They're not stopping opponents from gaining rhythm. And one of the things I have been talking about this season with Newcastle United is they are very good at setting up 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes of constant pressure in opposition territory. And if you don't stop them from gaining that rhythm, you are toast. They are going to score at one point or another. And the teams that have managed to withhold Newcastle are those that have actually stopped and disrupted them. But I bet you all these teams have lost quite handsomely to Newcastle this season. And they've all lost to Arsenal and Man City too.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. And obviously, I'm not saying this as a Fulham fan because I think it probably applies to Brentford and I think it applies to Brighton as well. But you look at the three teams crashing the top 10, if you will. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but you know what I mean. And you see how they play, how they set up, and they're all very, very at your throat. You know, they are not letting teams breathe. And it's why there's been such success, I think, amongst those three teams in this Premier League season. They are willing to impose, even in bigger games, a game plan that doesn't just involve sitting off and hoping that it works towards the end of games. I mean, it's no surprise not to see Antonio Conte's Tottenham in that top 5 list, for example, because of the way that they set up. But I do think it's interesting just to kind of take a little bit of a dive into them and notice that there are trends, if not perfect alignments, with where people end up in the table, especially at the bottom half. And where they sit in this metric. Let's shift onwards to sequences because there are some very, very interesting names in this list, Sam.
This actually kind of floored me a little bit just because if I sort of shut my eyes, click the button and go, right, who's going to be top of this? I assumed it would be Rodri or Thomas Partey, basically. We're talking about two holding midfielders who play for ball-dominant top sides in the league. Now, the player at the top of this list does also play for a ball-dominant top side in this league. It's Kieran Trippier. But the fact that he's so far clear of Rodri and he's in the number 1 spot, it really did surprise me. So we're defining sequences here as possession sequences, you know, stringing together passes, time on the ball. Newcastle will see a lot of the ball. So we're going to have players that feature relatively high up in this. That's fine. But for a right back to be this integral and this important is pretty stunning. And for a right back to be involved in more of their team's respective play than Rodri is for Manchester City, I was just a bit stunned, really. And I think this goes a long way to showing just how important Kieran Trippier is to Newcastle, just how heavy that skew to the right-hand side is for Newcastle, where he plays. And it's no wonder he's absolutely killing it in fantasy football. Like, everything goes through him. He's the most integral player in the Premier League to their team's use of the ball.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. It felt like it was going to be a Rodri clear by a mile, didn't it?
Yeah.
And Newcastle's tilt to that right hand side has been very, very impressive. I think it's one of those where obviously Trent remains here in third and remains an absolutely crucial cog in this Liverpool side. Now, yes, they are underperforming in terms of league position. Yes, this hasn't been necessarily, the season that they will want to remember. But with all the questions asked of Trent on such a continual basis, it is just a nice reminder that he remains absolutely crucial to the way that Jurgen Klopp wants to play with Liverpool.
Yes, absolutely. And this is also a visual reminder that Pierre-Emile Højbjerg has played 1,500 games this season, because I think on a per game basis, he probably wouldn't really hit this list. It's just that he literally never doesn't play. Like, he's just there all the time. And James Ward-Prowse is the same. These guys are ever present for their team, and they are looked to by all of their teammates. I did have a quick look to see where Thomas Partey lands in this list, because I was a little bit surprised that a team as dominant as Arsenal, and with him as the key cog in build-up, he wasn't in the top 5. And I actually had to go to page 2 to find him. He was 35th with 753 sequences. Much, much lower than I really expected. So I'm not quite sure what's happened there. Maybe he's just missed a couple games and therefore missed a couple hundred sequences. And it's as simple as that. And this statistic is as much a fitness race as it is an importance race. But I was a bit surprised to see Thomas quite so low.
Yeah, I mean, was there an Arsenal player in front of him off the top of your head? Or
I think maybe one of the, actually I've actually got it right here. Let me have a look. We got Arsenal. No. These are all defenders. I don't think so. No.
Okay. Right.
No.
It's an interesting one. Right. We actually have a question here about this from Vincent, who says, does this make Ziyech less appealing for Newcastle? He also hangs back and delivers balls into the box from the right. Would that take away from Trippier's space? I think it's a really interesting point, but I don't necessarily think that they would utilize Hakim Ziyech in the same way that Chelsea have at right wing back.
So I don't think they'd occupy each other's space. I was watching Newcastle last night, watching Almiron cut inside on the left foot and then feed the ball on the cross run to Trippier. So when Almiron kind of ducks inside, he brings the fullback with him, turns his body, and then he just slips the ball into Trippier. Ziyech can do this. The difference would be Trippier makes the run and is ignored. I think is probably the way I'd put it. So Trippier is slinging less or fewer balls into the box. He's getting less of the ball on the overlap because Ziyech is probably more willing to take his share of the pie there and cross the ball in himself. Whereas Almiron is quite happy to defer to Trippier, I think. As much as he's had an excellent individual season, he is quite happy to defer. So I don't think they're getting into those spaces, but they might be fighting each other for opportunities to cross, which can create an interesting dynamic.
Okay, indeed. Right, let's roll onwards to shots from headers. And this is one that on paper, I was like, wow, that's very, very interesting. And then you informed me that this is a continual trend.
Yeah, I mean, it's still weird. And I went back to last season and had a look, and they were top last season as well. But yeah, shots from headers, Liverpool are top. Top there with 52 over to Tottenham's 50. Let's see Fulham in there, Jack. 4th place. Well done. All Mitrovic.
To be fair, they are all Alexander Mitrovic and Carlos Vinicius, and occasionally Paulinho from a corner. That is literally it.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I went back to last year, and Liverpool were top last year as well. They beat Burnley in headed shots by almost 20. And in 2020, 2021, so 3 seasons ago, West Ham were the only team that beat them. So they were second then as well. So this is a pretty consistent trend. Liverpool take among the most headed shots in the Premier League. Look, some of this is to do with shot volume. Liverpool are a high-powered attack. They take more shots than most. Therefore, their share of anything in the attack is going to be higher than most other teams. But I was still a bit like, I didn't really have them pegged down as like a particularly prolific heading team. And then you start to think about it and you're like, well, they've got 2 great crossers of the ball in Robertson and Trent. And as we've just seen on one of the previous slides, Trent is integral in terms of sequences and possession. And his greatest weapon is his cross. And then if I ask you, Jack, think about a time that Roberto Firmino scored a header. You'd actually probably come up with quite a few examples in your head.
Yeah.
And then, do you remember when we started talking about how, wait, hang on a minute, Diogo Jota is a really good header of the ball. Well, why is that? Okay, so then it starts to all click into gear, and obviously Darwin's taking his fair share too. And then when you consider the fact that Van Dijk is good for about 5 goals a season, all from corners, you have to imagine.
I was going to add to this, because obviously last season Liverpool's threat from set pieces felt really, really dangerous. It's dropped off a little bit, But I do think when you look at it, you go, they are getting those balls into areas. They have got players who can deliver into dangerous areas from set pieces. There are going to be shots from headed attacks and from headed opportunities. So it does make sense. I think a lot of this makes sense in terms of, I imagine City will have moved up in this list since they brought Erling Haaland in.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've just talked about the fact that Trippier loves to sling the ball into the box, which accounts for, I imagine, a lot of what Newcastle are doing. Mitrovic is Fulham's target man and is a massive aerial presence. That makes plenty of sense. It was the Liverpool one that jumped out, but when you do look at it with a little bit more of a fresh eye, I think it makes far more sense than perhaps people expect.
Yeah, I'm just going to have a quick look to see if City were in the top 5 last season. I bet they weren't, obviously. And the answer is absolutely not. No.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's that's basically on horse. So you could explain a lot of it, and you could explain Liverpool too, but I guess I looked at it and went, oh, that's weird. We never would have thought of it. Yeah.
This is titled Interesting Premier League Trends, right? This is it. This is from Drew, who says Spurs hiring Gianno Vio as a set piece coach has really increased our headers this season. And it's a really, really good point that I hadn't considered.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just about slinging it into Kane or anything like that. They've got so much better from set pieces in general, thanks to Vio. So I hadn't considered that. I mean, it doesn't feel weird that Tottenham are in this list, but I hadn't necessarily pinpointed the reasons why. And Vio is a really good shout. Yeah, it's probably why it's happened.
Okay, let's move on to this, because this is pretty stunning. Not necessarily unexpected, but to have all 5 players in the highest XGs conceded in counter-attacks on the pitch from Leeds United, well, it's something.
It's definitely something. Got to be trying to be kind here, but like obviously throughout this season, it's been clear that Leeds United are very, very vulnerable on the counter attack, and they do play on the edge. You know, this is the Jesse Marsch way. This is the Red Bull way. They press, they lose the ball and they press and they push up and they block out the narrow center of the pitch. And if you can beat the press, they are screwed, absolutely screwed. And we've seen it time and time again this season, time and time again. And I watched, Villa play them last week, the other Friday, whatever it was, and there was a Leeds had a corner, and it fell to Ashley Young, and he played one ball out to Camara, who ran 20 yards and played one ball to Bailey, and it was the back of the net in like 8 seconds. It's like this is a serious, serious weakness for Leeds, and unfortunately, if you're that bad as a team, 5 players of yours are going to be at the top. All the ranking means is that Illan Meslier and Robin Koch have played all the games, and so they're on the pitch when this happens. It's not to say that they're like the most responsible.
No.
It just means that they're there more often than not. This is a systematic problem that Leeds United have, and I don't have any idea how they're going to solve it without changing manager.
Yeah, it's not new either, is it?
No.
But it's one of those where if you're getting the payoffs from it, then it's fine. If you're not, then you're leaving yourself incredibly exposed. And we saw similar when Fulham went to Ellen Road, just absolutely picked them off through the middle, and suddenly you're away. I really did enjoy John Gilding's "oh dear" during the middle of that whole thing. Let's flip the script on it though and go to counter-attacking weapons. And again, it's a straight shootout, but this time from the other side of the War of the Roses.
Well, I bet you had a lot of fun developing that little subtitle there. I mean, yeah, actually, so again, similar scenario. Basically, this means that Manchester United are exceptional on the counter-attack, which they have been for a number of years, particularly under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, and we praise them for that. We just wanted them to be a bit better in the other phases. They lost sight of everything under Ralf Rangnick, and I think this is something that we need to give Erik ten Hag credit for. Man United are very clearly a much better team in structured possession and in open play right now than they were a couple of years ago. And they remain the deadliest counter-attacking team in the league. So he's harnessed everything that was good about the Solskjaer reign and then updated them, which deserves immense credit. And I think this really brings that into focus. And unlike the Leeds situation, where I think the ranking of the players is irrelevant because it just means they're on the pitch, I actually do think there's something in this, in that Bruno and Marcus Rashford deserve to be 1 and 2 because they are clearly the danger on counter-attacks. De Gea is there because he's played every game. Again, the same. But I do think the Luke Shaw, Eriksen, Fernandes, and Rashford presence here is illustrative of these four players are lethal when it comes to counters.
Yeah, I mean, and we've seen it obviously, and most notably probably in that Arsenal game where United were just so clinical. But I think it's important just to kind of you kind of answer the question from Vincent there, which was, does it change the narrative that Ten Hag has moved away from Ollie's system? It doesn't change that at all. That narrative still remains. He's just managed to keep hold of the good bits, which is a nice thing. And Sidith says, not signing Conte has been a great decision for Manchester United in hindsight. Absolutely. I think that's very clear at this point, despite the fact there were big calls for him to come in at that time. Let's move to our final slide, which is touches in the opposition box, which did bring a smile to my face and is the reason that Darwin is on the cover tile of this video.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised by this because I just assumed Erling Haaland would be top. And look, he's third. It's fine. But you've got two Liverpool forwards here in the top five. You've got Darwin top 7.3 touches in the opposition box per 90. This is a per 90 average metric. This is a lot. He's getting the ball a lot. Again, it goes back to what we said earlier. Probably, as we were talking about the others, it was like, well, the issue for Liverpool is not getting Darwin the ball. It's maybe what happens afterwards, and it's what happens if the team turn it over in an advanced position. But clearly, there's not too much wrong with the supply lines here, because if you're Darwin or you're Firmino, you've got to be happy with the amount of opportunities you're being given to do something with the ball.
Yeah, I mean, obviously these don't show us where these touches are in the box, which is obviously, a key metric in this. If, Haaland is picking up the ball 6 of those 6.7 times between the 6-yard box area, then he's going to have a better chance of scoring than Darwin picking it up on the edge of the box and trying to have to go through a lot of people to get in the way. But I do think that it probably does add to the narrative that the finishing hasn't been good enough from Darwin so far this season. Now, I think that will improve, but generally this season, that kind of disappointing level of finishing has been one of those things that people have kind of questioned with statistics. He's obviously scored a fair few goals, and more than maybe people give him credit for. His kind of contribution per 90, people have highlighted as okay. But when you're getting this many opportunities, those numbers should probably be higher.
Yes, I mean, I don't know what the split is between him and Haaland in terms of those contributions, but I imagine he's running at about 50% of Haaland, but so that would suggest, based on this at least, that there is a fair degree of underperformance happening. And the frustrating thing with Darwin is that, like, for a couple of years he underperformed his XG by a mile, and then one season at Benfica he overperformed his XG by 2 miles.
A country mile, yeah.
And now we're back to this, where at surface level it is okay, but like, just consider the amount of volume that's going through him, the amount of opportunities, the amount of touches he gets, the amount of headers. Like, it needs to improve. It just really does. And Liverpool have got tons of issues here to figure out over the course of the next 6 months, but chief among them is Darwin. And if he would to just become about 25% better, I think a lot of the other issues would start to be brushed under the carpet a little bit, because Liverpool will go back to being able to outscore just about anybody. But right now they can't.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. So Liverpool, decent defensive numbers, top and headed shots, have 2 attackers in the list for most touches. What's going wrong? I think part of it is what you say, that the output from Darwin hasn't gone to the level that it needs to be if he's getting that volume. But equally, none of this addresses the issue that Liverpool have, which is the gaping hole in the middle of their midfield.
Yeah, I mean, the midfield is not really working. So like the actual massive problem for Liverpool is the setup and the structure of the midfield, and the fact that the press doesn't seem to work anymore. I saw someone tweeting the other day, I thought it was quite interesting. It was like, it's getting harder and harder to press because people are getting better and better at playing out of it and playing through it. And as we all know, with pressing, it only takes 1 millisecond off from one player, one break in the link in the chain, and you're toast. You're absolutely done. And when you see teams like Fulham and like Aston Villa, who are like, mid-table-ish or probably end up mid-table-ish, playing through presses so easily at Premier League level, you have to wonder like how viable is like very high pressing if it's not going to be at 100%. And you can look at Liverpool right now and you look at their midfield and you just know it's not going to function properly. You know it's not there. And so there is an argument that they should really stop doing this, because it's been a problem all season and it might continue to be so. So yeah, that's the main problem. But again, if Darwin could score a few more chances, the focus wouldn't quite so be strong, would it?
Yeah, it would probably just take a little bit of pressure off those midfields to deliver in those phases, because you get those advantages. You go 1-0 up, you equalize, you get yourself a cushion, whatever that happens to be. It just takes that pressure off. But with that, Sam, I think it's probably time for us to call it a day. All that's left for me to do is say thank you so much to everyone for watching today and for your questions in the comments. Please do like and subscribe the channel if you're new here. We've got some new subscribers, I think, from our Basque-umentary, if you will, last week. I hope that you've enjoyed this. Sam and I be on here talking about various bits and bobs around football across Europe and beyond every week. Thank you to Mr. Samsai.
Cheers, buddy.
I've been Jack Collins. This has been Ranks FC. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you soon.